I guess I'm live. Good. Ice cream. Hot. It's important. How are you doing? Well, I just got done with a Zoom funeral, which is a weird experience. And then later, I have a Zoom meeting. So in between a Zoom business meeting for an out-of-state event and a Zoom funeral, I am doing class. I hope all has been going well with you guys. I will hope that by tomorrow, which is Wednesday, I will be seeing the papers. I have one of your papers already, but I need to see two more papers on the chosen figure that you all chose to talk about. So, without any further ado, we are going to get going with today's class, which is called The Turn 1780. Now, we'd already touched on 1780 last time, but we're going to do some more because it's a really important year. And it's really funny because most historians kind of leave 1780 alone. They act like, well, not enough happened. It wasn't a big deal. I'm going to send you the list of how many battles happened in 1780. And it's shocking. I mean, you're going to see it and you're going to be like, and we're going to be talking tonight about three of them. This morning, I guess it really is for you. We're going to be talking about only three of them. So there's a huge amount that goes on, and there's really some of the most important turning points of the war are happening at this point. 79 was a rough year. Bad things happened, and it was not a really year of progress. But 1780 is like, you can kind of hear it's like someone chipping away at ice until it finally breaks and gives way. So anyhow, one thing that happened in 1780, although this is not so much Revolutionary War, it is related. Benjamin Franklin, it is believed in 1780 is the year that he was tired of having two pairs of glasses and tried putting his glasses together, taking the glass and putting the top part for distance, the bottom part for reading, and invented bifocals, which I'm wearing right now. So, thank you, Ben. One of the first things I want to talk to you about is people who are not going to make your regular history book, but they're characters that I happen to like a lot. Again, we have shifted to a lot of what's going on in the South, although we will still be moving back and forth. Again, it's like a civil war down there. Not a huge amount of British soldiers, but a huge amount of British militia that are Americans that are serving the crown, and Patriot militia. And these are neighbors against neighbors. So amongst them, in South Carolina are Grace and Rachel Martin and their mother-in-law, Elizabeth. Now, I think it's Grace, as I recall. She was married at 14. A little scary, I know. But by the time that we are in the Revolution here, her husband is serving in the militia in the South, and she has 3 children. And her sister-in-law is Rachel Martin, who is married to one of Grace's brothers. And so they're in the house of their mother-in-law, in other words, their husband's mother, Elizabeth, in South Carolina. In the efforts made to strike a blow at the invaders' powers, and this is from the reports that were written from their recollections, so this is one generation off. This isn't Grace and Rachel writing this, but they were interviewed, and this is what they had to say. In the efforts made to strike a blow at the invaders' powers, the sons of Martin family were amongst the most distinguished for active service rendered and for injury sustained at the enemy's hands. The wives of the 2 eldest, during their absence, remained at home with their mother-in-law. Man, I hope they like their mother-in-law. That'd be a really long war. One evening, intelligence came to them that a courier conveying important dispatches to one of the upper stations was to pass that night along the road guarded by 2 British officers. They determined to waylay the party at the risk of their lives to obtain possession of the papers, because they didn't want the information flowing through. It would have only put their husbands at risk. So, for this purpose, the 2 young women disguised themselves in their husbands' clothes, and being well provided with arms, took their station at a point on the road which they knew the escort must pass. It was already late, and they had not waited long before the tramp of horses was heard in the distance. It may be imagined with what anxious expectations the heroines awaited the approach of the critical moment on which so much depended. The forest solitude around them, the silence of the night, and the darkness must have added to the terrors conjured up by busy fancy. Presently the courier appeared, with his attendant guards, and they came close to the spot. The disguised women leaped from their cover in the bushes, presented their pistols at the officers, and demanded the instant surrender of the party and their dispatches. The men were completely taken by surprise, and in their alarm at the sudden attack, yielded a prompt submission. The seeming soldiers put them in on their parole. That means that they gave them release to go. And having taken possession of the papers, hastened by a shortcut through the woods back to their home. No time was lost in sending the important documents by a trusty messenger to General Greene. We talked about him being the new commander in the South at this time. The adventure had a singular termination. The paroled officers, thus thwarted in their mission, returned by the road that they had taken and stopped at the house of Mrs. Martin, asked for accommodation as weary travelers for the night. The hostess inquired the reason of their returning so soon after they had just passed her house a short time before. They replied by showing their parole, saying that they had been taken prisoner by two rebel lads, two rebel boys. The ladies rallied them upon their want of intrepidity. Had you no arms? They asked. The officers answered that they had arms but had been suddenly taken off their guard and were allowed no time to use their weapons. They departed the next morning, having no suspicion that they owed their capture to the very women whose hospitality they claimed that night. I think they got treated pretty well, considering. But anyhow, an interesting story. And it also kind of shows you just how close to home this war is getting at this point. This isn't battlefields off in the distance. This is couriers riding by your house at night. That means the enemy is in the area and is active. And so there's a lot of violence that's going on, and a lot of it is being inflicted upon the residents of the area. So some people we're going to be talking about. Patrick Ferguson, really interesting guy. He's a Scottish officer in the British Army. He's an early advocate of light infantry, which means kind of, your troops that go in without so much stuff with them, but they go in fast and hit hard and then pull back. And the designer of the Ferguson rifle. I'm going to try and see if I can find a link to include so that you guys can see what the Ferguson rifle looks like. It's a really interesting weapon. You have to remember, muskets fire way faster than rifles in the era, right? Rifles are very accurate, but muskets can throw way more lead downfield. So you could get someone who's really good with a musket, and I mean really good, could get 4 shots off in a minute. One every 15 seconds. That's huge. Well, the Ferguson rifle, of course, is rifled, which means that, and rifles, if they got 2 shots off in a minute, that was huge, because it was really harder to load a rifle. The Ferguson rifle had this really interesting mechanism where you turned, it's by the trigger guard, but there's nothing else on any other rifle like it, so it's good. But you turned it, and there was a depression in the top that opened up, and you put in the ball, poured in the powder, and then you closed it back up and fired it. And they could get 6 shots off from a rifle, which can be aimed carefully where a musket can't, a minute. So this was a game changer, right? England must have bought every one of their men one of these rifles, right? No. One company of men is all that got them, because Ferguson basically paid for it to make sure that he outfitted them. But the British Army said, those are really expensive to make. And while it's a really good weapon, it's really neat, we are going to get more mileage out of outfitting several soldiers with muskets than just one here and one here and one here, because these rifles were just too expensive. So it's kind of one of those inventions ahead of its time. Ferguson is pretty brilliant in his invention. And then he is at the Battle of Brandywine Creek, which we passed back in 1977. And he was actually shot in the arm, and it hits his elbow, cripples his arm. He's never able to bend his arm again. Basically, he'll never be able to use his own rifle again for the rest of his life. And he is in the South now supporting General Cornwallis. We've already talked about Cornwallis last time. We're also going to talk about Sir Bannister Tarleton, 1st Baronet, was a British soldier and politician. Tarleton was eventually ranked as a general in the years. He is a light horseman. So cavalry, fast operations. These are the officers that ride in, and they're just brutal. I don't know if you've ever been around horses before, but if you've ever stood on the ground when a horse is running towards you, it's intimidating. If you think of an entire group of soldiers outfitted on horses and coming towards you, it's the ground just shakes, and it's a very intimidating thing. So these officers, this officer corps, I should say, Tarleton's, they're very, very good at what they do, and he's a very effective officer. Now, I should have mentioned, here's your sheets that you guys have. We've already passed that Grace and Rachel Martin were 2 women from South Carolina, and they tricked the Loyalist messenger by disguising themselves as men. And now we are coming up to the Battle of Waxhaws. Waxhaws is a really interesting battle. That's one of those examples of there are 2 sides to every story. The short version of it is it took place on May 29th, 1780, near Lancaster, South Carolina, between a Continental Army force led by Abraham Buford and a mainly Loyalist force led by British officer Bannister Tarleton. Buford refused an initial demand to surrender. So these horsemen rode in, surprised them. They were setting up camp. And at first, Buford refuses to surrender. But when his men are attacked by Tarleton's cavalry, men threw down their arms to surrender. Buford apparently attempted to surrender. However, the British commanding officer Tarleton was shot during the truce. So, he put up his arms. He said, basically called for peace. And so this guy gets shot. Bannister Tarleton gets shot, or I should say, he was shot at during the truce, causing his horse to fall and trap him. So basically, all these British soldiers saw Tarleton go down, and the Loyalists and British troops were outraged at the breaking of the truce in this manner, and they saw their officer down, and so they just full-on attack all these surrendering rebels. Right? These guys have either thrown down their weapons or they're laying down their weapons, and they get killed. While Tarleton was trapped under his dead horse, men continued killing the Continental soldiers, including men who were not resisting. A little quarter was given to the patriots or rebels. Of the 400 or so Continentals, 113 were killed with sabers, 150 so badly injured they could not be moved, and 53 prisoners were taken by the British and Loyalists. Now, newspapers, being what they are at the time, which are not in any way impartial, they take this and they run with it. It's even bigger in some ways than the Boston Massacre at this point in the war. It becomes known as the massacre, the Waxhaws Massacre, or Buford's Massacre. But they also talk about Tarleton's quarter. Now, you have to understand that in the 18th century, you talk about giving quarter. That means that you're allowing someone to surrender. When someone put up a black pirate flag, they were saying there'll be no quarter. When you're in battle, if they're saying there's no quarter given, if you don't surrender right now, there's no quarter, it means that they're not going to allow anyone to surrender from this point on. They're going to kill everybody. So they start referring to the killing of prisoners, or those surrendering, as Tarleton's quarter. They're trying to paint him as a very merciless man. Now, he's a good officer, and he is a very effective officer. So he was pretty much hated in the South by any of the Patriots. So it wasn't a big jump for them to decide to hate him for something else. But now he gets this monstrous reputation so that people want him dead. So anyhow, like I said, Tarleton's quarter becomes a common expression for refusing to take prisoners. In some subsequent battles in the Carolinas, a few of the defeated were taken alive by either side, because from this point on, everyone's like, there's not going to be any quarter. It's going to be Tarleton's quarter, so we're going to fight to the death. This Battle of Waxhaws becomes the subject of an intense propaganda campaign by the Continental Army to bolster recruitment and incite resentment against the British. Equally valid accounts of the battle by soldiers from both sides describe Tarleton as having no part in ordering the massacre, as he'd been trapped under his horse, and when freed immediately ordered thorough medical treatment of all American prisoners and wounded. So he's gotten a bad rap. But in the era, you wouldn't know that. We've got these things that are told to us now, but at the time, there wasn't any video to go back to see what happened. There's nothing for anyone except for those who were there, and they're not going to get their voices out because they're in the army. The newspapers are going to be written by people far away. So, unfortunately for Tarleton, he gets to be the bad guy for a long time after this. So propaganda, so that was the Battle of Waxhaws, took place on May 29th. Waxhaws. Propaganda after the battle led to the killing of prisoners to be known as Tarleton's Quarter. Tarleton''S, quarter, Quater. So then there's going to be someone else that we get to talk about here, or actually a couple more people, but one of them here. At this point, on July 11th, 1780, the Expedition Particulière arrived in America. That's the code name that was given by the French government for the plan to sail French land forces to North America to support the American army against Britain. So this is really exciting for the Americans because, of course, we've had financial help, we've had supply help, but this is actually soldiers. And we're talking about 5,500 soldiers, and they're expecting a second wave of 2,500. Unfortunately, the 2,500 never make it because they are unable to escape the British blockade of Brest, France. But anyhow, so 5,500 soldiers who are well-trained, well-equipped, well-uniformed soldiers have landed in America, and they are going to be at America's service. This is massive. This is almost, adding a whole other army, basically, to the forces of the American troops. They arrived in Rhode Island, and so on July 11th, 1780, a French army of 5,500 arrived in Rhode Island, for your paper. Leading them is General Rochambeau, Rochambeau. Rochambeau. Have you ever done rock, paper, scissors and heard someone refer to it as Rochambeau? Somehow his name got associated with it over time. Very weird. So anyhow, you guys, you've been with the Army for a while now. You know what Washington always wants to do. So when Washington finds out he has this army here, he decides he wants to make a plan to attack New York. Of course, New York. He wants to liberate New York. And that is, he's serious. He's in negotiations. He's talking with the French, discussing how they can attack New York. And Rochambeau takes Washington out in a boat through parts of New York, around New York, and shows where the water is and how deep it is. And French ships are very deep-hulled. And so he says, this is not a good place for us to attack, and I'm not even sure that once we attack that we could hold this island, this Manhattan Island, on top of which they have a huge amount of ships. They have a great advantage in that they're already there, already supplied, already entrenched. Now, this is not a good battle, and Washington's very frustrated by this. But they're there, and they're hoping that something can be done. And so Washington is desperately looking for the way to utilize these French forces. All right, so now we go back down south, because that, of course, was up in Rhode Island and New York. And all right, so up until the summer, up until the summer of 1779, even George Washington was not sure if it was going to be a good idea to have French troops there. But then it's like he recognized we need something to change the status quo because nobody's making any progress. So he was very excited to see them show up at this point. Lafayette would soon return to America, and Washington was hoping that either he would be back being a major general in the Continental Army or an officer at the head of a corps of gallant French. when Lafayette, let's see. All right, we're just going to go down here. Oh, but this is interesting. Within weeks of their arrival, a group of about 20 Oneida and Tuscarora Indians came to visit Rochambeau in Newport and assure him of their old and continuing friendship with the King of France from the French and Indian War, and to offer their assistance in the struggle against the British. Remember, most soldiers, or most Native Americans were either on the British side or they wanted to stay neutral. This means a couple groups that come in saying, "Oh no, we want to help. Definitely, if you guys are here, we're with you guys for sure." A group of Abenaki and Micmac Indians visited as well and offered to join the war on the side of the French. So, late in September 1780, Rochambeau met with Washington at Hartford, Connecticut. And that is where he was told initially that they had too many sick to embark in any military action right then. And Rochambeau's trying to cool Washington's jets a bit. He doesn't want him to get too far ahead of the game here. All right, so down in the South. Oops, I need to go down here. So I told you about Patrick Ferguson, and I need to go back a couple pages in my notes so that I can find, there's another gentleman I want you to meet, and his name is Isaac Shelby. He's an American. He's the first and fifth governor of Kentucky eventually, but not yet. And he'd served in the legislatures of Virginia and North Carolina. He's a soldier in Lord Dunmore's War, the American Revolution, and he would go on to fight in the War of 1812. But it was Buford was ostensibly would have been linked up with Isaac Shelby in the South, and so when he heard about this, this was an attack that he was very angered about. And so Major Patrick Ferguson at this point has been appointed inspector of militia, of British, loyalist militia, on May 22nd, 1780. His task is to march through Old Tryon County area, raise and organize loyalist units from the Tory population. They have the Carolina backcountry and protect the left flank of Lord Cornwallis's main body of the army at Charlotte, North Carolina. So he's got some pretty important jobs there. And he goes about it in a really interesting way. He goes through and he uses a huge amount of propaganda, says, "Oh, you men, you've got to come side with us because we're the only ones that will protect you from these savage neighbors of yours who are obviously not even men enough that, you shouldn't let them come in because they'll attack your women. And, they'll try and make, savage babies with your children is what he basically says. And gets them all riled up, but it really does a better job of ticking off the Americans, the American patriots, rather than the loyalist Americans. Loyalist Americans are like, all right, we're already with you. So, but anyhow, he does a good job of raising troops, and then there's the Battle of Musgrove Mills, which I don't know. Let's see here. Oh yes, it's mentioned here on your paper. On the morning of August 18th, 1780, 200 mounted Patriot partisans, so these are just militia with their own horses, under joint command of Colonels Isaac Shelby, James Williams, and Elijah Clark. There's going to be a lot of names. I'm going to thin them down, and we're just going to focus on Isaac Shelby more than anyone else. There are other people that deserve credit, but we've only got so much time. So, which control the local grain supply. They want to attack the Loyalist camp at Musgrove Mills because that controls the local grain supply. And food and supplies are everything. Something I forgot to mention, when the French arrived and saw the Americans, they were like shocked. And remember, it's 1780. It's not 1775 or 1776. 1780. And they were shocked because they said, they don't seem to have a complete uniform amongst them. But they're ready to fight, and they were very encouraged by how ready they were to fight. But they said they don't look like an army. So if you think they didn't look like an army, imagine these guys that are all militia down in the South. So they're attacking. They want to attack, a surprise attack, and a raid on the Loyalist camp at Musgrove Mills, which has controlled the local grain supply and guarded a ford to the Inori River. The Battle of Musgrove Mills, August 19, 1780, occurred near a ford of the Inori River, near the present-day border of Spartanburg, Laurens, and Union counties in South Carolina. Patriots anticipated surprising a garrison of about equal number of loyalists, but a local farmer told them that Tories had recently been reinforced by about 100 loyalist militia and 200 provincial regulars on their way to join British Major Patrick Ferguson. The whole battle took perhaps an hour, and within that period, 63 of the Tories were killed, an unknown number of wounded, and 70 were taken prisoner. Patriots lost only about 4 dead and 12 wounded, and none captured. So it's really a for your surprise attack here on number 8. The answer is it was a Patriot victory, and it really set the pace for something to come next. At that point, Shelby is being chased because Ferguson is furious, and so he gathers as many men as he can and starts really a hardcore pursuit of Isaac Shelby and his troops. But they keep managing to evade them. Now, let's see here. I'm going to jump on down a little bit here. So Shelby, he starts gathering men here that have crossed back over the Appalachian Mountains. This is basically Shelby is moving back and forth between the other side of the mountains and coming through. One of the things is that Appalachia in that country, a huge amount of these men are from that area. And because they are from over the mountain, they become known as the Over Mountain Men. And they're really, if you think that a normal kind of frontier town would have been full of some rough characters, these are the guys that the frontier town is too civilized for. These guys are, they're living out in the wilds. They're the kind of guys that would hunt a bear by themselves with a musket and a knife. Mountains and retreat the terrain. There we go. Okay. Sycamore Shoals, present-day Elizabethtown, Tennessee. And by the next month, on September 25th, 1780, Colonel Shelby, Seaver, Charles McDowell, and 600 Over Mountain men had combined forces with Colonel William Campbell and his 400 Virginia men at Sycamore Shoals muster. About 1,100 volunteers from Southwest Virginia and today's northern Tennessee area, known as the Over Mountain Men, as I mentioned, mustered at this rendezvous. Meanwhile, 2 deserters from the Patriot militia reach Patrick Ferguson and inform him that a large body of militia are advancing towards him, waiting 3 days for reasons that nobody knows. To this day, we don't know why Ferguson waited 3 days, but he waits 3 days, decides, I'm going to order a retreat to Lord Cornwallis and the British main forces in Charlotte, sending a message to Cornwallis requesting, please send reinforcements. The request does not reach Cornwallis, unfortunately, until 1 day after the upcoming battle. I should say, unfortunately for him. On October 1st, Ferguson reached North Carolina's Broad River, where he issued another pugnacious public letter calling for the local militia to join him, please excuse the language, lest they be pissed upon by a set of mongrels. By that he means the Over Mountain Men. On October 4th, the Patriot militia reaches Ferguson's former camp at Gilberttown, where 30 Georgia militiamen join them. Anxious for action, on October 6th, they reached Cowpens, South Carolina. There'll be a battle there later, where they received word that Ferguson was east of them, heading towards Charlotte and Cornwallis. They hurried to catch him. Rebel spies reported Ferguson was making camp on Kings Mountain with some 1,200 men. Ferguson, rather than pushing on until they reached Charlotte in safety, just a day's march away, camped at Kings Mountain. Again, we don't know why. Huge mistake for him. And sent Cornwallis another letter asking for reinforcements. Kings Mountain is one of the many rocky forested hills in the upper Piedmont, near the border between North and South Carolina. The Loyalists camped on the ridge west of Kings Pinnacle, the highest point of Kings Mountain. Needing to hurry, the Patriot militia put 900 men on horseback. Okay, 900 men on horseback? That's a lot of troops on horses very quickly. And rode for Kings Mountain. They left immediately, marching through the night of the 6th and morning of the 7th, even though the rain never stopped. By sunrise on the 7th, they forded the Broad River, 15 miles from Kings Mountain. By the early afternoon, they arrived and immediately surrounded the ridge and attacked. This is a really bizarre battle. I've told you before, you always want the high ground. The British have the high ground. Ferguson has the high ground here. But when the battle opens up, there's about 900 Patriots, including John Crockett, who's only mentioned here because he's the father of Davy Crockett, a later American legend. They hit that western base, that western ridge, start climbing up. They formed 8 detachments of 100 to 200 men, and Ferguson is totally unaware the Patriots have caught up to him. And then they attack and lay into him. The Patriots catch him by surprise. Loyalist officer Alexander Chesney later wrote that he didn't know the Patriots were anywhere near them until the shooting started. As the screaming Patriots charged up the hill, Captain Abram de Pestier turned to Ferguson and said, "These things are ominous, and these are yelling boys." I just skipped over swearing. 2 parties led by Colonels John Seaver and William Campbell assaulted the mountain's heel, the smallest area but highest point. The other attachments led by Shelby, Williams, Lacey, Cleveland, Hambright, Watson, and McDowell attacked the main Loyalist position surrounding the base of the heel. No one in the Patriot Army held command once the fighting started. This is really weird. There is no one in command of these forces. Every man is in charge of his group of men, and that's it. So there's no overall strategy at this point except get them. And so there's no organized lining up. They're coming from behind bushes, trees, everywhere you can imagine. So now they're headed up the hills. The Patriots lack bayonets, of course. So the British line up, make a bayonet charge, drive them back down the hill. Come back into position. Patriots charge up the hill again, screaming, yelling, firing as they go up the hill. And each of these independent units making their ways up. And during one of the charges, Colonel Williams was killed, Colonel McDowell was wounded. Firing was difficult for the Loyalists since the Patriots constantly moved using cover and concealment to their advantage. And plus, these are all hunters. These are all guys who know how to hide and shoot at things. So, again, those Over Mountain men are just, they're in their terrain. They feel at home. Ferguson's the one who's the fish out of water. So, after an hour of combat, Loyalist casualties were heavy. Ferguson rode back and forth across the hill, blowing a silver whistle he used to signal charges. Shelby, Sevier, and Campbell reached the top of the hill behind the Loyalist position and attacked Ferguson's rear. The Loyalists are driven back into their camp where they begin to surrender. Ferguson draws his sword and hacks down any small white flags that he saw popping up. So his Loyalist forces, sorry about the sun, it is just coming in right now. Can't do much about it. So Ferguson's Loyalist forces are trying to put up white flags and surrender, and he's riding through and trying to slice them down with his sword. The Loyalists are driven back into their camp. Okay, we mentioned that. Popping up. But he appeared to know the end is near. In an attempt to rally his faltering men, Ferguson shouted, "Brave boys, the day is ours!" He gathered a few officers together and tried to cut through the Patriot ring, but Seaver's men fired a volley, and Ferguson was shot and dragged by his horse behind the Patriot line. There he was confronted by an opposing rebel officer who demanded a surrender from the major. Ferguson shot and killed the man with his pistol in a final act of defiance. Immediately, everyone fires at him, and he's shot dead by multiple Patriots on the spot. When the Patriots recovered his corpse, they counted 7 bullet wounds. Seeing their leader fall, the Loyalists began to surrender in droves. Some Patriots did not want to take prisoners as they were eager to avenge the Battle of Waxhaws that we talked about before. Boy, that sun's going to be brutal now. Oh well. Tarleton at Waxhaws, Tarleton's horse was shot. Of course, we talked about that. So, Loyalist Captain de Pestier, in command after Ferguson was killed, sent out an emissary with a white flag asking for quarter for several minutes. The Patriots rejected de Pestier's white flag and continued firing, many of them shouting, "Give him Tarleton's quarter! Give him Buford's play!" A significant number of surrounding Loyalists were killed or wounded, including a white flag emissary. When de Pestier sent out a second white flag, a few of the Patriot officers, including Campbell and Sevier, ran forward and took control by ordering their men to cease fire. They took about 700 Loyalist prisoners. The Battle of Kings Mountain lasted 65 minutes. Loyalists suffered 290 killed, 163 wounded, and had 668 taken prisoner. The Patriot militia suffered 28 killed, 60 wounded. But the Patriots now are worried that Cornwallis is going to come, so they have to move out quickly. And they have very little food, very little supplies, and they're exhausted by what they've just done. But so Major Shelby's men were chased by Ferguson Ferguson. Number 10 is Shelby managed to surprise Ferguson at Kings Mountain. And 11, this became a major victory and turning point in the South. And that's one of the things that I really want you to see here is that, this is, remember, in the South, what General Greene said before. We fight, we get beaten, we rise, and we fight again. This is 2 victories in a row that just took out an entire flank of Cornwallis's army. This means Cornwallis is now cut off from supplies. It means Cornwallis is not protected on that flank. It's opening up some new possibilities. The whole war is going to hinge on things that happen in the next few months after this. So, major turning point, as I said. Below in your pictures, you are going to see pictures of Bannister Tarleton looking sharp, and you will notice wearing green. That's right. Not everyone in the British Army is wearing red. Artillery officers wear blue. In this particular unit, they wear green. Patrick Ferguson, obviously dead now, and Isaac Shelby. Now, remember what Ferguson said before, that if you don't get here quickly, if we don't get support from the locals, we'll get pissed on by these mongrels. Well, they were pretty savage guys, and unfortunately that was one of the last things they did, was once they dug a hole for him, they relieved themselves on him. And a lot of British sympathizers bemoaned the fact that an honorable officer like Ferguson could possibly come to such an end. Now, Ferguson has another famous moment in the war. It's completely unsubstantiated. There's no way to know, and parts of it don't even really fully make sense. But essentially the story goes that he was out and he was on a reconnaissance mission where he was moving forward trying to get information. He had his rifle with him, and he saw an officer with a very large hat on, and he was attended by a Prussian hussar, which is a very specific uniform, and said that he had him in his sights, but he was an officer and he was not any threat to him, and so he felt it was wrong to fire upon him, so he didn't. But when he reported it to a doctor that was a friend of his back there, he said, that was almost undoubtedly General Washington. Well, Washington was in the area, so it's possible, but it doesn't prove in any way that this was who he was looking at. We also know that there was a Polish, Casimir Pulaski was it Casimir Pulaski? I believe so. Was in the area that could have been with him, would have been attired in that way. But again, he could have been any other officer too. Washington wasn't known for wearing a big hat. In fact, if you look at all the paintings in the era, he's not wearing a huge hat. He's wearing a regular size hat, and he's a big man. So the fact that this was someone who felt the need to wear a really ostentatious hat makes me think it's not Washington. But there are a lot of people that really believe that story and think, oh my gosh, if Ferguson had fired, it would have been the end of the war, really. And who knows? Maybe it could have been. Those moments of history that everything could have been different. At any rate, I think that is wrapping us up for today. That got us done pretty quick. I'm sorry again about the light. It is evening here, and there's no way to escape from the setting sun. I will include the list of battles in your information that I send to you in your email. So have a look at that just to see how many battles were going on. Now, the war is really starting to pick up a high speed, and things are going to happen really quickly over the next few weeks. We only have, I think after today, maybe 3 classes left. So the war is going to be wrapped up, and we're going to come to our final tests in that time. So I look forward to talking to you more soon. Please drop me a line and tell me how you're doing. I hope it's well, and we'll talk to you soon. Have a good day.